Okay, we have been remiss in announcing, I guess, that one of our major sponsors of this conference has been Humanities Montana.
Thank you.
And just coincidentally, our next speaker, Ken Egan, is the executive director. It is coincidence, right, Ken?
Pure coincidence. Pure coincidence.
Humanities Montana is based here in Missoula, and it provides programs and grants on history and literature, Native American studies, and more all over the state of Montana. Ken joined Humanities Montana in 2009. He was born in Polson, graduated high school in Great Falls.
I'm a bison.
A bison.
Yeah, say that.
He received his BA in English from the University of Montana, so he's also a Grizzly. Ken has deep roots in this state. He received his PhD in American Literature at the University of Wisconsin, a Badger. He taught literature and writing at Middlebury College in Vermont, a Panther. Rocky Mountain College, another bear. Then this one really threw me, though. The University of Athens in Greece. No team name, he said.
Anarchists.
Anarchists.
That's what they are. They really are.
And also Comenius University in Slovakia, which also probably didn't have a nickname. And finally, Drury University in Springfield, Missouri, which was also a Panther. None of that has to do with anything. Ken's book, Ken's one of several authors of new books or soon-to-be published books here with us today. His book, Montana, 1864, which shares stories of the many people who lived and traveled to Montana in the year of the territory's founding, will be published September of 2014. And all proceeds will go to the Humanities Montana. We bring you Ken Egan.
So can you hear me? You can hear me? You cannot hear me. Oh, shoot. Can you hear me? You can hear me. Very good. So I come to this topic, to this conference, from a very unusual angle. I have to take you back to April 1964. And you might wonder, April 1964? First of all, I was 7 years old, so I've just revealed my age. But anyway, my grandmother took me into Chicago to see a certain spectacle that I bet you can recall was traveling through America, the United States, in 1964. It was the Montana Centennial Train. So grandmother, she was a homesteader who had been kind of compelled to come to the upper Midwest to join my father's family because grandpa had died suddenly. And so grandma finds herself there in the suburbs of Chicago, and she's desperately homesick. And she says, my God, I've got to bring my grandkids into Chicago to see this train. So I'll never forget the experience. It was amazing. And the image that I have from the train that's lived with me all these years is, do you know the J.K. Ralston painting After the Battle? After the Battle. It's a massive painting, really, frankly, a very gory portrayal of what's happening after the Battle of the Little Bighorn. And it was truly the only image that stuck in my mind, but I can remember my younger sister and myself standing there just staring at this image, all of these vignettes of, frankly, atrocities occurring after the battle. So as we approach the Montana sesquicentennial, isn't that fun to say, sesquicentennial, the 150th anniversary of Montana, I found myself thinking, what kind of train would we design today? So what I'm doing with my book, Montana 1864, is trying to imagine a virtual sesquicentennial train. And I would submit that it's very different from the train I experienced in Chicago in 1964. And what I'm trying to do is give a broad panorama and focus not just on the people who came to Montana, what was soon to be Montana, but the people that were here, that were living here. And of course, we're talking about the tribal nations. And so when you buy a copy of Montana 1864 in September, because all proceeds go to Humanities Montana, when you buy that book, you'll discover that there are a fair number of vignettes, moments, passages dedicated to the people who called this home long before most of our ancestors arrived. So I just want to make that observation. So what I'm going to share with you today, Kim was great. He approached me and he said, so I understand you have this book coming out. Anything relevant to the Mullan Road? And my first thought, immediate thought, was I want to share with you the story of Sun River Indian Farm. And some of you, I've visited with many of you already, and many of you know some of this story already, and I'll share in depth. I'm going to read an account of what happened there. But it's an amazing story because it is like a nexus or a convergence of all of these threads running through what's happening in Montana at the moment it's being converted into a territory, being made into, created as a territory. So we're going to have outlaws, we're going to have love, we're going to have this interesting attempt to convert the pagan, particularly the pagan Blackfeet, to both farming and Christianity. All of that comes together. And of course, I have to emphasize Sun River Indian Farm is located on the Mullan Road. So you'll hear as I read this story, you're going to hear Mullan Road kind of running through it as a motif. It's going to come through again and again. So before I begin reading, let me just explain. Because I come out of a literary background, I decided it'd be fascinating to tell this story from the point of view of James Vail. James Vail is the missionary school teacher, farmer, who's recruited to come to Sun River Indian Farm by the Indian agent at that time, Henry Reed. And James Vail, you have to realize, is only about 26 years old. He's a young man by our standards, much older by the standards of that time. He's a mature man. He's lived a lot already. And so here's James Vail, and the exact moment he's telling the story is May 1864. May 1864. So as the story begins, James Vail is thinking back on his 2 years in this territory, this region now called Montana. It's actually technically just about to be named Montana. It's not there yet. So May 1864, he's at Sun River Indian Farm, and he is telling what happened to him and his family when they came to Montana. And it's not a happy story, I have to say. Because this is a history conference, I wanted to emphasize my sources. So just to tell you, where did I get this information? We do not, to the best of my knowledge, have a firsthand account from James Vail. So what I rely on is Francis Thompson's amazing journal. If you haven't heard of it, Francis Thompson, A Tenderfoot in Montana. And published by the Montana Historical Society Press, I want to say 2005. It's a terrific book. I'm also relying heavily on Frederick Allen's book, I love this title, called Decent Orderly Lynching, which to me is the best. Yeah, it's a brilliant title. To me, it's the most compelling, most persuasive account of what happened in Virginia City and Bannock surrounding the vigilantes and all of that. And then this is an amazing source if you haven't experienced it. Gad E. Upson was the agent to the Blackfeet and Gros Ventre tribes when the Vails had their last few moments here. So we have the 1864 report to the Superintendent of Indian Affairs written by Gad E. Upson. I'm smiling because Gad E. Upson arguably is one of the most ill-informed agents ever to spend time in Montana. But his report includes a letter from James Vail. So I at least have that as a source. So that is the setup. So you're about to hear James Vail's account of his 2 years in Montana, and I will try to watch the time. I'll try to stop early so you guys can ask questions. So I hope you enjoy. Our hopes are blasted. Torrential rains and the waters raging out of the Rocky Mountains 3 times caused the Sun River Indian Farm to flood this May, all crops ruined. Before I continue, how's the volume level? Is that pretty good, or that's good? Okay. We came to the Upper Missouri with such faith in 1862. My wife, Martha Jane, her sister, Electa Bryan, our 2 children, Marion Harvey, and myself, James Vail. Our minister, Henry Reed, offered us this opportunity when he was appointed Indian agent to the Blackfeet and Gros Ventre. The Sun River Indian Farm was built to demonstrate the practicality and virtue of a settled agricultural life for the wild Blackfeet tribes, a provision of the Blackfeet Treaty of 1855, which we heard about earlier in a couple talks. It would also serve as an Indian school, bringing enlightenment through secular and sacred texts to our dusky brothers. We felt the call to help the Indians learn the ways of civilization and Christianity. We heard the skepticism of many on board our steamer who openly declaimed they put little faith in the success of our enterprise. And in fact, people who came upriver with the Vales in 1862 were downright cruel. We know this because we have actually letters to newspapers which state bluntly the Vales are fools. So they were held as naive. So unlike those doubters, we believe the Indians possess souls but must be brought to the light. As a teacher of 18 months in Iowa, I knew my ability to move even the most recalcitrant student to improve. We embarked for Fort Benton from St. Louis on May 14, 1862. In that second year of war on the riverboat Emily, Captain Joseph LaBarge commanding. With 150 passengers and full of supplies and equipment for the mining camps, as well as provisions for the Indian tribes, it appeared an unsinkable craft. Yet at times our steamer seemed a frail bark on those fickle waters as we churned against the surging waters of the spring rise and the stiff winds out of the west. Those powerful waters reminded us that sublime mountains rose to the west, capturing snow and feeding rivers. We would soon be living in the shadow of those peaks. We were comforted by the knowledge that our riverboat was preceded by a sister craft, the Shreveport, lighter, faster, and so able to navigate the shallow waters of the upper Missouri during the dry summer months. By the way, that was naive too, as those of you who are experts on this, and I'm thinking of Ken Robinson, for example, the Shreveport never panned out, as it were. It was never a very useful craft on the river. Since this steamer left nearly a month before us, we did not anticipate seeing her until reaching Fort Union at the junction of the Yellowstone River. We were also reassured by the company of distinguished men on board our boat, most notably the partners in the American Exploring and Mining Company. One of their leaders, Francis Thompson, would prove a dear friend during her trials on the upper Missouri. The first stage of the journey through the state of Missouri provoked thoughts of our national strife, the War of the Rebellion. We witnessed burned out cabins, fields destroyed by fighting men and fire, cannon and rifles discarded as though flung by dying arms. Much of St. Joseph had been blackened by fire and destruction. At night, while smoking my evening cigar, listening to the steady rhythm of the river coursing against the docked steamer, I often found myself meditating on the purpose of our journey in a time of war. I could not escape the conviction we sought a new beginning, a kind of utopia, I suppose, as far removed from the meanness and intractability of those times as possible. This seemed true for most on board the Emily, though some had far more material motives than we, motives only fueled by tales told by mountain men streaming downriver toward St. Louis with animal skins and news of glorious gold mines and visions of emigrants striking out for the mines on the Oregon Trail as we passed Omaha. I worried most about Electa, slight, intelligent, and naive. There's irony there because, of course, as you'll discover, James is naive himself. When she implored us to join this great adventure, we could hardly fault her, yet fear for her we did. Electa pleaded that she could watch and tutor our children, do her share of farm chores, help teach the Indian school, and provide assistance should Martha Jane face the prospect of bringing forth another life. However, if Mrs. Vale and I saw the journey as a mission, a spiritual trial, Electa viewed it as a chance to leave behind the tedium, routines, and tensions of her family's small Ohio town. We knew that we might expose her to danger with the Blackfeet, a notoriously unpredictable tribe, as strong and fickle as the Missouri. We did not anticipate other dangers in the form of a charming stranger of her own race. So I'm going to skip a bit there. I actually narrate their journey up the Missouri. It's extremely interesting, as what James is witnessing is the actual process of handing out the annuities to particularly the Sioux. And he's quickly starting to realize that this is not a system that is good for anybody. But I'm going to skip over that section. We want to get to Fort Benton and the Mullan Road. Reaching Fort Benton, our hearts soared, even as the difficulty of our task sunk deep. This port of call is but an adobe fort and thrown together wooden buildings along the river. We noted locals call the place Benton City, a grandiose term, no doubt a hopeful anticipation of the city to be, the St. Louis of the upper Missouri. Still, we adopted this usage as our own. We had the good fortune to be greeted by Little Dog, whom we took to be the chief of all the Blackfeet. Short but powerfully built, he wore the blue coat of an army officer. He presented a friendly countenance, telling us through our translator that he would send out messengers to his people's camps, encouraging them to come to Benton to trade for the goods our intrepid steamer had delivered. Little Dog gave me hope that our model farm could alter the Indians' view of the agricultural life. And I might as well skip ahead and just give away the news that Little Dog is actually killed by pagan tribesmen in 1866. And one of the major reasons we believe is precisely because he was cooperating with the Americans. He was actually supporting the Sun River Indian Farm. So that's just something to keep in mind as we proceed. We soon formed a party to embark for the Sun River. The Vale family, Francis Thompson, Joseph Swift, a young fellow who agreed to work with us, and Major Reed. Since the weather had turned warm, even hot, we had a pleasant 2-day jaunt across the prairie. Of course, they're on the Mullan. The Rocky Mountains looming closer and closer as we approached the Sun River. The farm did not present a promising face, understatement. It was in truth a fort, the palisaded walls and rough cabins made out of aging, cracked cottonwood. The only caretaker for the place for many months had been an Indian named Iron, who could not prevent the theft of many implements and horses by our native neighbors. As Francis dryly noted, there were few Indians taking instruction in farming. Since it was already late June, I puzzled over how to make good use of this first summer in our new home. We decided to concentrate our energies on starting a garden, planting a few acres of oats and wheat, and serving as a lesson in respectable, cultivated behavior for what we hoped would be many swarthy guests. But I get ahead of myself, discounting the pleasures of being in our new home, in a new country with charming visitors. And we do have to remember that James is 24 years old in 62 when they arrive. They're young, and they arrive here. Major Reed exuded his typical energy and electrical spirit, walking the banks of the Sun River, declaiming to the sky of God's glory in the shadow of those stunning irregular peaks to the west. Francis told stories of his life as a banker back east, meeting reluctant clients and teaching them the errors of their ways, but above all, nearly dancing with glee at the prospect of opening his business in this new land and breathing the mountain air that could be a tonic for his bad lungs. Young Swift would prove a godsend in his dogged determination, his willingness to stay by our sides through trying times, yet he could not protect us from a snake within. No one could. Our next order of business was to repair the broken ferry that was so vital to taking men, wagons, animals, and material across the still powerful sun. Reed, Thompson, Swift, and I set about this simple but protracted task. We then witnessed Mr. Thompson's departure for the mines. He evinced joy and a bit of trepidation at casting his lot with fate. That vast country swallowed a man slowly as he rode south on the Mullan Road. And when at last we lost all vision of our friend, I felt the emotion rising in my throat. For all the time we had been together on the Emily, our visits with Indians of all stripes, the cordelling, the songs sung and prayers shared, we could only hope to see that good man again. We settled into our routine for the first summer. Joseph and I repaired the plow, tilled the soil, and planted the crops. Martha Jane and Electa put the buildings in order, bringing a woman's sense of order and grace to those graceless cabins. The children, just 2 and 4 years of age, learned the art of amusing themselves in a wilderness, catching dragonflies, tracking harmless snakes, and building their own small versions of our fortress farm with sticks and stones. Major Reed commenced his duties as Indian agent, traveling to Benton City on occasion and visiting with Little Dog and other friendly Indians. The Blackfeet chief had created his own small farm just a few miles from us, though his crops fared little better, in fact, worse than ours. We were fortunate to benefit from the skill of Iron, who interpreted Little Dog's words, supplied wild game, and cared for the livestock. All he asked in return was an opportunity to share our meals and smoke the pipe. These were requests easily fulfilled. We read the Bible much together, kept our eyes sharp for unexpected visitors, and reminded ourselves daily of the purpose of this long journey into these wild, untamed lands. When Indians approached us singly or in numbers, my heart jumped to my throat, for I was not used to confronting them in this isolated place with my family so exposed. Most often they were hunting or traveling to meet with others of their kind, but they would stop out of curiosity, peer into our doorways and windows, grunt with satisfaction or doubt. Our good hunter could communicate with them through signs and later explain their intentions. Tribesmen of all kinds passed by our fort, Pagan, Flathead, Bannock, and Nez Perce. Our farm was located on a very old road leading from the mountains to the plains, the means for tribes living west of the mountains to journey to the land of buffalo. Even a man untutored in Indian ways could see a kind of wonder in our dusky guests as they left behind the narrow mountain passes for the sweeping prairie, as though the sky opened up for them and showed a new expansive world. Perhaps then it should not have surprised me that we saw little evidence of interest in our work, especially as the crops were struggling due to late planting and scalding sun, and our lives seemed sedentary and vexing to men and women used to a nomadic life. Only Little Dog continued to evince an interest in our work, though we sensed he paid a price in scorn from his people. Soon enough, the river overflowed its banks, following torrential rains. Our meager crops were overwhelmed by the mountain waters. Garter snakes and muskrats plagued our cabins. Our monotonous days were broken by emigrants following the Mullan Trail to and from Benton City. More than one sojourner hinted at possessing gold garnered in Bannock, gold they carried back to the States to claim a new life. They were ruffians as well, hard-faced and hard-spoken men who looked at my wife and sister-in-law with impudent familiarity. It was not those mysterious natives alone who caused me concern. I said a prayer each time such rough company continued on the trail. The weather turned golden in September. The aspens and cottonwoods yellow-leafed in the south-turning sun. The river receded at last, yet it was too late to save our oats and wheat. As the first frost coated our cabins in early October, I came to fear the grip of winter. No doubt travelers on the Mullan would diminish with no prospect of finding passage back to the States. Major Reed had already taken a craft down the Missouri to obtain the Blackfeet annuities for the following spring. By the way, one of the key themes of this story is Major Reed virtually abandons the Vales. If any of you are familiar with the career of Henry Reed, he concludes fairly quickly the Sun River Indian Farm is a mistake. He withdraws support from it, and he leaves. He leaves and never returns. And so here are the Vales who had trusted him, and they're abandoned. They're virtually abandoned here. He's not the hero of my story, you might say. Okay. Major Reed had already taken a craft down the Missouri. As I looked about, considering our isolated situation and just Swift, Iron, and myself to fend off threats, I wondered whether I might find an extra hand in Benton to carry the burden of protection through the long winter. In truth, I held out little hope of finding such a man, yet ride to Benton I did with a kind of quiet desperation. Imagine my wonder and relief to discover not one but two men interested in my proposition, Henry Plummer and Jack Cleveland. Can I assume everyone knows who Henry Plummer is? Okay. They had passed us quickly on their way to Benton only a week earlier. They were a study in contrasts. Plummer was a true gentleman in countenance, dress, and speech, though maimed fingers on his left hand suggested a harder life than one might suppose on first acquaintance. He stood about 5'10" with brown hair and gray eyes. He was an easy conversationalist, eager with stories of his travels and adventures in California and Washington. He was a man one could easily like. Cleveland presented a more threatening appearance, rough around the edges and often vulgar in his speech. I could not conceive how these two came to be partners on the road, but when I asked if they'd be willing to spend the winter at Sun River Indian Farm, they readily agreed. They had arrived in Benton with the expectation of transportation to St. Louis, only to discover that the travel by Mackinac was not recommended due to the threat posed by the Sioux. Our humble farm presented a far nicer prospect than the bleak port town. Reactions varied when I arrived with our two guests. Martha Jane was dismayed at having two men, particularly Cleveland, in close proximity during winter confinement. Joseph showed delight at the prospect of male companionship. Harvey and Mary believed they had found two new objects of study, and Electa grew very quiet. A small, clever woman, Electa had that unusual ability to become large or small depending on the occasion. One moment, one might not be aware she was in the room, and the next, she roared like a lion. I had learned that when she grew quiet, she was not so much withdrawing her attention as focusing it. Certainly our guests took notice of her, particularly Plummer. You can probably guess where this is going now. A brother-in-law is often the last to know or understand in these cases. My eyes averted, concentrated on Cleveland. I did not detect the deep affection growing between Electa and Plummer. Martha Jane hinted at times, hoping that I would intervene and discourage such a connection. We had all fallen half in love with Henry, for he seemed a decent man with a hard life. He did not conceal some of his brushes with violence and the law in California. It was the need for human companionship during those days, enclosed in our snug cabin. He told stories to pass the time and to give us a glimpse into his life. It was not unlike Othello telling his tales of war to Desdemona. Electa began to attend to him in a way I had never seen in her. By the way, Electa is about 20 years old herself, which, as you probably know, is somewhat old by the standards of the time. So we have Electa, who's about 20, Plummer's about 25, 26. So these are all very young people. There was no great mystery to the attraction between them. For a talented young teacher from a scattered family in Ohio, living in the wilds of Dakota Territory with an Indian hunter, with an Indian for hunter and Indians for occasional guests, perhaps such a fixation or attraction was natural. Yet I presumed the difference in their experience would dissuade a more enduring relationship. Not being romantic myself, I did not anticipate the course of their affection. Cleveland grew more peevish and irritable as the bond between Electa and Henry came clear. One time, as Henry and I were feeding the stock hay, he told me of his strained relationship with his traveling companion, hinting at deeper causes. I could sense the reasons for it. Jack could be boisterous and even playful with the children, and he could be surprisingly gentle with Martha Jane, but he emanated a restless energy that demanded outlet. At times, his language and manner slipped, revealing a hidden nature, rough and untamed. I had no doubt he had harmed other human beings. Still, the mystery of his connection to Henry remained. We would not be sorry to see Cleveland depart for points east in the spring. Yet depart he and Henry did not. This is the moment I must admit to my own culpability, my role in this tragic play. I tolerated the growing affection between Plummer and Electa, and it was that very bond that persuaded Henry to remain in the region. Rather than taking the first Mackinac east to St. Louis, he would stay to marry my sister-in-law. How many lives would have been spared the agony of what followed had I acted the proper part of a guardian and guide and prevented the engagement? I cannot plead ignorance of that option, for Martha Jane drove it home with increasing fervor. She told me she was heartsick at the prospect of her sister marrying this stranger, arriving as if by magic out of his troubled past. In late November, as fear of Indian predation receded since they were in their winter camps, Plummer and Cleveland prepared to journey to Bannock City with Henry's promise of returning in spring to complete the nuptials. I was relieved to see them go, yet troubled by the prospect of that summer wedding. Martha Jane and I vowed to do our best to break off that engagement. We were aided by the unexpected return of Francis Thompson in May. He had taken a grand journey to the Pacific coast and had just returned to what was now Idaho Territory. But he had a frightening tale to tell of Mr. Plummer, now sheriff at Bannock, gleaned during Francis's travels. By his account, Plummer had shot Cleveland dead in a barroom brawl, instigated by Henry's fear his traveling companion would disclose some compromising information about him. It seemed a cold-blooded act, compounded by Plummer's attempt to lure another citizen of Bannock into a gunfight simply because that man may have heard Cleveland's dying confession, implicating the sheriff. The agitated Frances urged my sister-in-law to delay the wedding, return east for a time, and marry in the fall if that remained her desire. At first, Electa fought against this argument, expounded on Plummer's virtues and the envy of lesser men, and said she would renounce her family before her fiancé. But when Martha Jane joined forces with Frances and me, Electa's resolve weakened. She viewed her sister as her guide, the longtime source of comfort and wisdom. Yes, she said, yes, she would return east at the first opportunity, then await the verdict of her heart. But there was to be no such opportunity. Plummer arrived on June 2nd, far earlier than anticipated, and all of young Electa's determination to delay dissolved. Oh no, it was a fervent, moving reunion, that I must admit. I must recall that Henry, for all his worldly experience, was only 27, and Electa but 21. We extracted a promise to delay the nuptials until Major Reed returned to the fort, but when he had not arrived by June 20th, I agreed to ask a priest at the nearby St. Peter's Mission to perform the service. That was a challenge unto itself for devout Methodists, but there seemed no deferring the union. June 20th, 1863, the cusp of the longest day of the year, proved a wonder of light and warmth on the Sun River. Martha Jane refused to participate in the ceremony, withdrawing to her room to weep. Adding an almost farcical touch to this tragic proceedings, Frances stood in as Electa's maid while Joseph performed the part of best man. No one could deny the bride and groom illuminated the room with their joy. Electa was dressed in a simple brown calico, yet her eyes shone with emotion and her smile proved irrepressible. Henry appeared in a blue suit that displayed his manly form. Oh no, I could not doubt their fitness for each other in ways spiritual and material. Father Joseph Minitre performed this lengthy Catholic service, but it did not seem tedious or idolatrous there in our humble cabin. The cross currents of emotion pushed me through the event as though I were on a frail bark descending the flooding sun. We were all riding that frail bark. After a wedding breakfast of buffalo hump and cornbread, the happy couple rode a government ambulance pulled by 4 wild Indian ponies south toward their new life in Bannock City, and just a little bit more. It was but 2 months before we would join them, much to our surprise. The summer devolved into a cascade of crises, every bit as fluid and powerful as the Great Falls of the Missouri we had visited earlier in June. First was the increasing threat of Indian violence, our fears only compounded when Joseph absconded to the mining metropolis as Francis' assistant. We were doubly fearful since our loyal hunter Iron had been murdered by Bannock Indians earlier in the spring. Our interpreter and hunter now departed for the afterlife. We had grown so fond of his kind, reliable guidance. He was a gentle soul. He deserved better. We could never quite sort out the tribal conflicts that took his life. So, I think I will stop reading there. And what happens next is that the Vails conclude that it's a failure, that the Sun River Indian Farm is a failure from personal perspective, from the perspective of actually trying to convert the Pagan and other Blackfeet tribes to an agricultural life. They themselves removed to Bannock City. And on September 2nd, 1863, Electa, now Plummer, gets on a coach heading south on the Corinne Road. So Plummer, to his credit, we believe Plummer urged her to leave. So she leaves on September 2nd, 1863. Anybody know what happens to Henry Plummer on January 10th, 1864? Well put. That was well put. That's exactly right. So Electa is spared that, thank God. Unfortunately, Mrs. Vail is not spared that, all right? She's on site. She's in Bannock on that day of the hanging. Meantime, James Vail is back at the Sun River Indian Farm. It's a kind of complicated story. So he's not there to witness the hanging in January of 1864, but that is, of course, what happens. Very briefly, so the Vails leave Sun River Indian Farm the summer of 1864. They return to Iowa. They then transplant to Vermilion, South Dakota, where they establish a long-term life. Electa joins them there, and after many, many years, she does remarry. To the best of my knowledge, she rarely, if ever, spoke about her marriage to Plummer, which is revealing in and of itself. We also know Frances Thompson sent her money from the estate of Henry Plummer, so Electa did receive money, and Frances Thompson reports he never heard from her. So it suggests to me that she wanted to completely expunge this whole episode in her life, this horrific episode. So anyway, that's the story so far. You have to get the book to read the rest of the story. So thank you very much. So I'm happy to take questions. Questions, yes. Questions? Yes.
Where was the farm in relation to the present town of Sun River?
So the town, to the best of my knowledge, is, there's a marker as you drive into Sun River, and I believe the Sun River farm was located very close to that marker. That is my understanding. The Montana Historical Society folks believe that as well. I've kind of consulted with them. So it was not huge. As I say, it was palisaded, so it was a fort. I believe there were 6 buildings. It was in total disrepair. And I should be clear, so this farm was built by the Lame Bull / Blackfeet Treaty of 1855. It was not actually built, apparently, till about 1859. And from the beginning was a kind of disaster, mainly because of flooding on the sun and then the intense temperatures. But over and over again, the Indian agents report it's in disrepair. Many of the implements are being stripped out. And, the claim is that the implements are being stripped out by Indians. I have a hunch that immigrants on the trail might have been taking a thing or two as well. So in pretty bad condition. It was, by the way, I don't know if I mentioned this, it was burned to the ground in 1866. So the Piegan, at the same time that they kill Little Dog, they attack the farm and completely raze it. And I think that's pretty indicative or suggestive of how they viewed the whole experiment as well. Yes, I believe so, yeah. But that's a good detail I'm going to investigate now. By the way, I meant to say that at the start. If you catch any errors in all of this, please let me know, because I don't send the manuscript to my publisher for another month, so I can still make fixes. So if you catch anything, you got to let me know. So, other questions? Now, how many of you are familiar with this story? Is this a pretty commonly known story, or a few? Yeah. I think it's just an amazing account of how these naive individuals, they really were that idealistic. Frances Thompson, who knew them well, reports the Vales were this idealistic. And for them to end up actually involved with Henry Plummer, right, is just an amazing thing. I have to do another poll. This just is my point of information. It's not terribly relevant to Mullan Road. How many of you think Henry Plummer was guilty of the crimes for which he was hanged? This is interesting. A small minority. How many of you think Plummer was guilty? Let's do that again. How many think Henry Plummer was guilty of the crimes for which he was hanged? It's a pretty even split. Those of you who don't think he was guilty, do you want to say why, just out of curiosity? You think he was a... Oh, you want to say why? Yes, I'm sorry. You want to tell us why he wasn't guilty? Or?
Well, there's a theory he was a Confederate, and they were trying to stop gold shipments to the Confederacy.
Okay. So he was killed mainly because he was supporting the other side, the other cause, as it were. Yeah. Okay, very interesting. Yes?
The only trouble with that theory is that there were former Confederates in the vigilante movement. The common bond of the vigilantes, I know many of you know, was Masonry. I mean, they were fellow Masons, and whether they were North or South, they were bonded. They trusted each other in this wild frontier territory. There are revisionists like the Madsons have a couple good books out on how wonderful Plummer was and how he couldn't possibly have been the bad guy. But
you're thinking of, is it Hanging the Sheriff? Is that one of their books? Hanging the Sheriff is a good read, though, I have to say. It's fun. Truly. Any other questions, thoughts, comments? Yes?
I just thought that Plummer was originally from Maine, wasn't he?
yeah, he was.
Yeah. But I think it's fair to say he was a Democrat. I think that's a fair statement. Though my sources suggest that he was not a kind of ardent or, a kind of vociferous Democrat. He kind of played that low key. We know that in part because there's another section in the story I didn't have time to read. He has Thanksgiving dinner with Sidney Edgerton and Wilbur Sanders in November of 1863, virtually a month and a half before he's hanged. He has Thanksgiving dinner with them. And as best we can tell, Plummer believed he was on a charm offensive. He gets a turkey from Salt Lake City, right? He provides wine. And we don't know what exactly was said during that conversation, that dinner, but whatever was said, Plummer was not persuasive. But apparently he was not, so in their face, because as you know, they were radical Republicans. They were all about supporting the Union cause. So he seemed to be pretty skillful at navigating those political waters. So, yeah. So, yes?
Ken, you asked how many thought he was guilty to raise their hands, but you didn't ask how many thought he wasn't guilty to raise.
Oh, I'm sorry, yes. Yeah. So, how many think poor Henry Plummer was a victim of those diabolical vigilantes? Is that a good way to put it? Okay, how many thought he was maybe a little innocent? Or innocent? So, Celeste.
See people who didn't have money, they don't even.
Oh, yeah. That's a good point. So,
Yes.
Rick Allen, he wrote a great book, and he's for Plummer being guilty, but he doesn't convince me. So I figured there's a pretty good chance that maybe it's concocted. He has quite a few explanations of things the vigilante state is fact.
Yeah.
There's a lot of stuff that's just not true in Dimsdale and in
That's
Lansing.
true. That is true.
So, I think it's kind of a question.
yeah, it's still an open question. Frankly, it's fun to debate. I can't agree more. So the comment is that many of the early sources we rely on to convict Plummer are definitely of questionable veracity. I mean, Thomas Dimsdale, the guy isn't pulling any punches. He's making the case. He's advocating for the murdering of these individuals. I'm going to call them murders, the vigilante hangings, however you view the individuals who were hanged. I mean, these are vicious acts. And Dimsdale, just comes right out, and he's just blatantly propagandistic. And Langford, I would say, is similar. And,
Not as blatant, but
Langford is simply plagiarism. Langford didn't write
Correct.
based on anything. He just took McConnell's
That's right.
vigilantes or Payette and
That's right.
other sources. And just, in fact, there's spots in it where he makes statements of something that somebody said,
Yeah.
and it's the exact same statement that that person said in Dimsdale's. So Langford was not, in fact, I've seen one diary where Langford, I believe, went back east in November or December and wasn't even there during the time of the vigilante movement.
Gotcha. Good.
And Langford's book, of course, came out many years after, right? So it was not an immediate book. It wasn't an immediate product. I do have to tell you, Francis Thompson strikes me as a pretty credible source, and I've referenced him already many times. But it seems to me Thompson's pretty convincing, though. Plummer was not a nice guy. He seems to have killed Cleveland in pretty much cold blood. I have to say that. And the other thing I didn't share is Thompson reports that Plummer warned him frequently to avoid certain people. So Plummer was giving Francis Thompson direct suggestions about specific individuals to avoid. And I just have to ask the question, now how could Henry Plummer know that? I mean, I just have to wonder. So anyway, we could go on having fun with that.
And Henry Plummer had three killings in time in San Quentin before he got to Montana.
Yeah.
So I don't necessarily buy into the total gang theory.
Right.
Henry Plummer was not a nice guy.
Yeah, and finally, and this will be my last comment, that many of those individuals were hanged on the evidence of one person, right, who may well have panicked. He was captured and he panicked and he said, these are the names of everybody involved in the gang, and the vigilantes, I think, were just so ready to act that they took him at his word. So enough said. So anyway, thank you very much. It's been fun.
Hi, I'm Diane Sands. Some of you know me from my work at the Historical Museum at Fort Missoula, but I've been involved in all kinds of women's history and Montana history for many years. And I have the honor of introducing a very dear old friend of mine and a person I've worked with for decades, Julie Cajune. Julie's been working in education, public education, for more than 20 years. She's a former classroom teacher and has a master's degree in education, and she has worked as a curriculum specialist for the Confederated, Salish, and Kootenai tribes. She returned to public education and worked as a school administrator for 6 years in Ronan. And during her tenure there, she was awarded the Milken National Educator Award, which I had a hand in when I was working at the Office of Public Instruction. She's worked on culturally responsive educational materials for the National Science Foundation, NASA, the Montana Historical Society, and other entities, including the Office of Public Instruction, implementing Montana's constitutional mandate of Indian education for all. She recently completed a 3-year project developing tribal history materials funded by the state legislature. And in 2009, Utne Reader named Julie as one of the 50 visionaries changing your world. The same year, she was awarded $1.4 million as a grant from the Kellogg Foundation, housed at Salish Kootenai College, and the grant activities focused on documenting community histories of tribes in Montana and across the country. Julie is a member of the Salish, Confederated Salish and Kootenai tribes, and she's also the recipient of the 2011 Governor's Award in the Humanities. And she currently works as an educational consultant. Please welcome Julie Cajune.
Have to hold this thing. Chesen Yakwake, good afternoon. I want to do something a little bit different with you than perhaps the predecessors at this conference have done. I always believe that we construct our own knowledge. I don't believe that knowledge is something that we give to one another. I think we have ideas and perceptions and thoughts about the world and about history and each other and life and all of that. And then we have experiences and we fit those into what we already think and know about the world. And so what I'm going to do with you is very different. I first want to apologize for not participating in your whole event. I've been traveling a lot. I'm doing independent consultant work. And I've been on the road, I feel like, since December. And so I literally just got home and did my laundry, and then I came here. And so I want to apologize for that. But I also want to talk about why I'm here. And I am not an official representative of the tribe. I always need to qualify that. Sometimes I am speaking as an official representative of the tribe. I am not. I am not employed by the tribe. I am a tribal member. So I am speaking to you as a Salish woman, as a yaya, I am a grandmother, as an educator, and as a student of my own people's history. And so I want to start with a huge context of all of these little minute details that people are talking about. Was Plummer guilty? Was he not? Who hung who? Who fell in love when? And we had dinner and wine and all of those things. And I want to get back to a really big picture because that's the way that I make sense of the world, is through a very large picture. And so in that large picture and context of what you are talking about today, which in a 24-hour timeline is almost at the end of that 24 hours. I want to talk about I want you to think about this huge amount of time before, which is rarely thought of, because the longest history of this place is tribal history and the history of animals and an environment where nothing was discovered when newcomers came here. Everything was already known and loved. So whether you feel it or not, all of us here are standing in a really old tribal world. It is so old. And I drove from Idaho, and when I started out in the morning, I could hear meadowlarks through my window. Through my car window. I've never had that experience before. They were so loud and so many that I could actually hear them through my window. And then at another point, I could hear the red-winged blackbirds. And those are two of my favorite spring birds. They always bring joy to my heart. Winter's over, spring is in Montana, and we can look forward to sunshine and being outside in a different way. And so then I saw the balsam root blooming on the hills, and I thought, the bitterroot's ready to dig. The bitterroot is ready to dig. And so yesterday, people from my community went out and dug bitterroot. A young girl dug the first plant, and people prayed like we have done for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years. And so a very old tradition was practiced in a very contemporary fashion. People drove their cars out there. I have a very modern Petza. It's not wooden, it's metal, and it's really easy to dig down into the soil. I had it specially made for me by a friend. And so all of the things that you were talking about, I'm going to ask you to suspend a thought of very contemporary history and to place this into a context of a very old tribal world and history. And so I'm going to try to help you do that by asking you to read 4 different things. And so the way that you're set up isn't going to work for me at all, because I'm going to give you 5 minutes to read something and then to talk to people about it. What is this that we've read? Another 5 minutes, and then we'll talk about that as a group for a minute or 2, and then you'll read a second thing. We're going to do that 4 times. And then hopefully at the end of all of that, you will have had these 4 different primary sources that is going to fit into your understanding of history and the world, and through your conversations with people at your table. And then I'm going to ask a brave group of souls to engage in what I call a Socratic seminar, a group of you that will sit at a table, and I will toss a provocative question about history to you, and then we'll all get to sit and listen to what you say about that. And then as a closing, I'm going to read just a few brief paragraphs from Sherman Alexie's book. I haven't read this book in ages, but I remembered that there's some history related to what you were going to read about, to Mullan, in this book. Who knew that John Mullan, or any of that history, was in Reservation Blues, which is about an Indian rock band, right? And Indian romance, reservation romance. So that's what I'm going to do. So if you can you guys all fit at the round tables? No? I think they said there's room for 56 at the round tables. So if you will readjust yourselves.
Oh, dear.
And so read 1. Your job is to read 1. Don't go on to 2 until we've read 1. Sally.
Thank you. We're not allowed to go ahead.
You can pass them out. Everybody needs 1, 2.
No cheating.
No cheating.
What about this big, like, you always want to make sure it's on here.
So read 1. You have 5 minutes to read 1, and then you have to talk to your table partners about it and say, what is that?
I think that was the demarcation between the old world and the new world by the Pope.
I'm a landscape architect.
What's the first
been posing in his
He's been posing as one. Because he's making a deal about the division from north to south. And that's what the Pope did at that time, to divide South America, part of South America away from the old world.
And you know the answer. Well, Dan's right on it.
Well done.
That's why Brazil went to Portugal. because of that line. True story.
True story. And what was the document that was the basis?
I don't remember. I might have known once.
How does that connect?
Are we supposed to do anything else with that first
We're
one?
supposed to be talking about it.
We're supposed to,
Huh?
are we
We're
supposed to
supposed
talk
to be
about
discussing it.
Have we been
What
given
else?
the
What
all clear to talk about it?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
It certainly has strong verbs, the first passage: invade, search out, capture, vanquish, and subdue all Saracens and pagans. It's very active.
There I go right there, I'll tell you.
What are Saracens?
Yeah, Saracens didn't have anything to do with, I think I learned that with the New World. But this is about
I
that.
think this is, I
These
think
are instructions to subdue,
some instructions
to go out to New Spain and subdue everybody there.
Yeah,
correct?
Saracens, right, they would be the Muslim defenders
Yeah,
of,
right.
of
So
the
it's-
Holy
so
Lands,
it's a
right?
crusade.
Yeah, but there aren't any Saracens in the New World.
Doesn't matter.
The New Spain, well,
It's a
that's not my
question of the whole
point. It
idea.
doesn't matter.
They don't know, right?
Yeah,
They
they
don't know
don't
what
know.
you're going to find out there. Might be some Saracens, and maybe that just really means like
Yeah,
others.
others.
The second part's easy.
To
And so,
reduce their
so what does that
persons to
have to do with
perpetual
what?
slavery.
Of course.
What would that have to do? What is
The Christian church, the Catholic Church at that time saw its role that into any location where the church was to go, their job was to convert the Native Americans into Christians. And the Pope was very concerned about that.
Julie just gave some clues. The first one's 1455 and the second one's 1493.
Columbus.
What, the second one?
Oh yeah, I remember what. The east part of South America really became under the control of Portugal.
Yeah.
Whereas west of that was the Roman Catholic domain.
Well, it was all Roman Catholic.
It was the divvying up.
It was the
of who got-
divvying up of who got
So I mean, they were
what.
divvying it up, but it was
Yeah,
Portuguese
which
versus.
And they thought they were giving Portugal the short end of the stick.
Yeah.
Which was done on purpose because they were the Portuguese.
Just all those World Cup
So,
soccer.
I believe it's referred to as the Papal Bull of this
Okay.
year, or and
Okay, how did you guys do? I think most everybody figured this out, right? Everybody knows that what you have are two papal bulls. The first one given in 1455, and the second one in 1493. And so why in the world am I talking about papal bulls and John Mullan? What is the connection? Anybody got an idea? How is John Mullan connected with these papal bulls?
Governor Stevens was supposed to remove Indians from their lands to allow the railroad to come through. And did so in less than 2 years. He removed 76 tribes, whether they wanted to go or not.
Okay, so he's read ahead to, and that is the second reading. He's on. No, this is, I wanted to have folks read this because this is really the basis of the doctrine of discovery. And so the doctrine of discovery was this Christian concept of law, of European law that was practiced by France and England and Spain, etc., in their travels around the world. And that if you come upon a country and the inhabitants are not Christian, then you have the right to try to gain title of that land. And of those people. And so I wanted to start with that because it's the beginning point of legitimizing how in the world did John Mullan come to be here. He was in the Bitterroot in 1853. So flip over your page and read about what he says then. So 1853 is 2 years before what? The Hellgate Treaty. Okay, so keep that in mind. Flip it over, read, and then talk amongst yourselves a minute.
Mullan's writing this one.
Yes. Number 2 is from Mullan's written report. An astute reader has already figured that out.
So have any of you seen Mullan's report from that winter in the Bitterroot?
I have.
I was at the National Archives looking in the map area, looking for something completely unrelated. And in this box that I think is labeled as like treasures is his field document. But it's not where it should be. So I don't, and I think I typed it all up, transcribed it. I've never shared it with anyone.
Well,
I should. Here's a crowd.
The
that would really
data
like
is split
this.
into 2 parts. At College Park, there are a few components of journals in the cartographic division.
This reading is pretty self-explanatory, right?
Well, they mixed them up between old military.
Before Mullan built the road,
And
he was commissioned to do this survey for the railroad. And this was 1853. So he was in the Bitterroot Valley before the Hellgate Treaty had taken place, correct? Right. So think for a moment. Just think about that. I think about it from my perspective. Did the Salish or Confederated invite him to the Bitterroot Valley? Was it in fact their territory, their homeland, where they had always lived? And here's this person going around doing a survey. And if you read his report, is very interesting. He talks about that the best way to deal with the Indians is to be forthright and honest about purposes and intentions. And so I was wondering, you know, how that happened, if he encountered, and he did encounter Salish and Confederated people, how he explained that intention. Yes?
It's only 20 years past Lewis and Clark, and so the Salish had welcomed them in that context over the 20 years before.
50. Well, 1805. Okay. It was September of 1805.
Right, so, I mean, yeah. Right. But again, they had been also having contact with Lewis and Clark remnants in the 20s and the 30s.
Yeah, Mullan wouldn't have been the only white person that they would have had contact with.
Right.
Right. So there were certainly traders and trappers, and there were missionaries, and there were lots of other people. So I'm simply just posing that question. Okay, now go to number 3. I'm going to stay on time. I'm breezing you through this so we can get to the end. And then read number 3. And then talk amongst yourselves.
Yeah, horrible day. Mary Ronan has an amazing account of that.
Kind of see very loosely translated remarks that they were trying to push several.
So there's a tension in there about where to locate a common reservation. That's part of what's going on there.
The Bitterroot, and so that they're trying to, so you can kind of infer this talking about going to one place. And then, of course, Victor died in 1870. And so his son Charles became the successor.
You know, and something that I just happen to know is that Stevens did not make it clear he was negotiating for land, right? So those who were participating in the Council Grove treaty negotiations, Native peoples assumed they were talking about issues such as protecting them from Blackfeet invasion, that kind of thing, right? And suddenly Stevens springs this on them that you have to give up land, right? So it's, suddenly there it is.
Right, if they created a reservation in the Bitterroot Valley, and they mapped it, it's on the
I
historic
showed that
map.
this morning.
Yeah.
If there hadn't been Blackfeet, they'd had to create them.
What's that?
If there hadn't been any real Blackfeet, they would have had to create them. They dealt with everybody in terms of the antagonistic relations with Blackfeet.
What do you think this testimony is from?
That's a great question.
There were lots of the treaty provision for the survey of the Bitterroot said that they wouldn't allow.
You mean the top one?
Oh, both of the 55 ones, yeah.
Are they from Council Grove?
Yeah, they're Council Grove.
Yeah, that's where they'd be from.
But, you know, I think it's from what,
But I mean, they're from the...
what the priest recorded, because when you read Doty's record, like with the Judith Council, he says that after Little Dog talks, and he says they talked like half the day, and there's one paragraph to say what they said. But in this case,
Okay, for the sake of time, we're going to move along really quick. So everybody figured out that the first two are from the Hellgate Treaty negotiations, and they're trying to push the Salish, Pend Oreille, and Kootenai into one area. And of course, Victor's wanting to stay in the Bitterroot, right? He's not wanting to move up there. Well, Victor died, I believe, in 1872, and so his son Charlo was his successor. And so then you hear Charlo saying, you know, he wasn't going to move either. And I found in John Mullan's report an interesting remark on that. And it's at the very end of his report, and it's under the heading, Indians Along the Road. So I thought it was very interesting. And now, let me put my glasses on. I can't read anything without them. So he says the Flatheads, and he's referring to the Salish, number about 400, and live by hunting and cultivating the soil. They are the best Indians in the mountains. They have treaty agreements with the government, but have never gone upon their reservation on the Jocko River. No steps have ever been taken to remove them thence, and they still reside in St. Mary's Valley, which by the terms of the treaty was guaranteed to them. And so Mullan is recognizing Article 11 of the treaty, saying, we will do a survey of the Bitterroot. So I thought that was very, very interesting. Under judicious management, they and the Pend Oreilles might be made to go upon a joint reservation, contemplated in a treaty made with them by Governor Stevens. And then he goes on to talk about our great horses and then how friendly we are most of the time, unless some great injustice is done to us, that mostly the Salish are friendly. So I thought that very interesting, that Mullan recognized that treaty guarantee at this time for a reservation in the Bitterroot for the Salish. Because the story goes, the survey was never done. Garfield was sent in 1872 to try to get the Salish to move to the Jocko Reservation. They refused. That document that he brought was later published with a mark as if it had been signed. And so the Salish felt that they were betrayed and that the people they were dealing with were dishonest. And so that's how that goes. And then we know they were removed in 1891. Okay, flip it over and we'll read number 4.
I think it's very important to understand 19th century culture. We have a different perception of what the roles of these different individuals based upon a 20th century culture. And the 19th century culture had a different set of standards completely. And the military did not see themselves as military. They saw themselves as the only law in the territory. They were completely ambivalent towards the settlers and the Native Americans. They saw them as being the peacekeepers, not as people to attack and defend. And again, interestingly, the army of the early 19th century was really an army that was trained for exploration and survey rather than military engagement. That all changed with the Civil War.
I was going to say, I mean,
They
yeah,
also changed with the code of conduct prior to the Civil War, too. I mean, you're talking Victorian standards, it doesn't matter whether they were English or American. It's a Victorian world because it's under Victorian era, Victorian stuff. So,
Let's let table groups talk. So that people have a chance to just have a conversation for a few minutes.
Oh, no, I was just trying to get a sense
Yeah, so this is after he's done the survey and the bid, right? And he's got, you know,
paragraphs long because it is.
You know, he doesn't want to do Irish, so then in the meantime,
Oregon,
the step to
Washington State.
incident which was a training and this is before what was a Mullan Road.
This side of this side of Montana divide versus this side of Montana.
Northwest of Mullan.
Yeah.
So, like the Rocky
Yeah, so you can kind of
Does anybody know why General Harney was opposed to hiring him?
you know, bring the survey.
What somebody said this morning?
Hiring.
Mullen?
Was written about him.
Which talk was that this morning? Somebody said that Harney had been opposed to it.
Stuart first. But that's a good question for Keith this evening.
Yeah,
He'll no doubt have some insight into that.
right.
'Cause I don't know.
Well, history would have changed a great deal in terms of what took place in the late 19th century. Mullan supported Sohan being appointed as an agent in this area. Gave him very good, he said he knows the languages, he knows the customs, the whole bit. And the Grant administration didn't listen to the letters at all. I mean, there was too much despotism in the Grant administration. Qualifications of the individual didn't mean anything. It was who you knew under Grant. But Sohan would have made a real major difference because he was a humanitarian.
Right.
He knew the cultures, and he was enamored with the people liked him, and he liked the people. And it's really Grant who caused a major change of history in terms of how he handled his native affairs.
Well, it was an ugly story.
But I gave Keith the letters that I got in the Sohan family from Mullan writing to the government supporting Sohan in an appointment. He did this twice, but then Sohan became ill at the time the Northern Pacific Railroad was completed. So he wasn't on the first train that Mullan was on when they came across through this area.
And that would have been 73?
83.
What year is the report Julie read from?
Huh?
What year is the report Julie read from, reflecting on the Bitterroot Salish? Is that at the end of the road construction? Yeah, what year was that one? The report on the building of the military road?
I've read it. I don't remember exactly where.
Come on, you guys, you're all Mullan experts.
Probably
Come on.
83.
Really?
63, I mean.
63.
63
That sounds
report is a
right.
big report.
Okay.
So 8 years after the treaty, he's reflecting
Well,
on
there
that
was
they're
another,
still
there
there.
was a preliminary report made in 1855.
And there was two
Well, it
reports
wouldn't
in
have been that one,
61.
because that one's reflecting on that they're still in the Bitterroot.
Yeah.
So it would be the,
I don't
63
recall
probably.
that from the 63 report.
No,
No.
the 63,
We'll have to
the
ask her what the
63,
source of
the
that was.
63 materials were different than the 1855 materials.
But I mean the discussion of native tribes.
Right.
I don't remember that from the 63 Mullan
I don't either.
report. So I don't know if it's
That'd be my best guess. That's where it is.
where
63 report.
I don't think so. The answer.
I don't know, but that'd be, the Woodbury's report, that'd be my guess.
Mullan was in such a hurry to get that report finished because he had an apartment next to the White House at that time. And he wanted,
Couldn't wait to get out of
he
it.
wanted to come back west.
Yeah.
I mean, he had great faith that the future was in the west because that's why he bought the land in Walla Walla. That was his dream.
Okay, since we started a little bit late, is it okay if I take like 5 more minutes? Okay. So we know a little bit about Colonel Steptoe, right, and fighting with the Coeur Lanes and Spokanes, and then Colonel Wright getting into it and bringing rifles that could shoot 1,000 feet into war with the tribes was pretty devastating, if you can imagine that, what Indian people were fighting with. And Wright's campaign, there were a lot of things that happened, but one of the things that was a conclusion was the slaughtering of 800 or 900 Indian horses. And there are two, depending on what report you read, there are two different numbers. One document I read said that they tried to keep 100 that they were going to try to use, but that those horses were so wild that they couldn't ride them. And so I'm going to read you a little bit from Sherman Alexie, because he actually talks about this. And then, of course, the other famous thing connected to Wright was the hanging of the Indian leaders, right? He actually sent word for tribal leaders to come to try to negotiate a peace. And he actually, the number that he hung is debated, but he did hang some Indian people. And he had also taken to holding Indian leaders and their families captive during this time. And he did that several times as leverage to bring tribal leaders to the negotiation table. And that's where Latah Creek was, the name was changed to Hangman Creek. And I think there is a marker there, and it's back to Latah Creek, which means Fish Creek. And there is a marker now for those horses.
Where was this?
Pardon me?
Where was this?
The
horses in that group?
Well, Latah Creek, I think
Flows into Spokane.
was by Spokane.
Hangman Creek is just west of Spokane.
West of Spokane.
In fact, it's between Spokane and the Spokane Airport.
And there's markers there for both of those. But when I read about those Indian horses, I thought about something that Vernon Finley said at Jump Dance one year. And I never forgot it. My sister, Ramona, who's a good artist, had done a print of horses, and I gave it to him after that. But he said, the spirit of the horse fell in love with Indian people. And then he sang a really beautiful song. And when he sang that song, I cried. And I wasn't really sure why, but it was a very powerful, moving song. And I thought it appropriate to read a little bit about those horses. 134 years before Robert Johnson walked onto the Spokane Reservation, the Indian horses screamed. At first, Big Mom thought the horses were singing a familiar song. She had taught all of her horses to sing many generations before, but she soon realized this was not a song of her teaching. The song sounded so pained and tortured that Big Mom could never have imagined it before the white men came and never understood it later. Even at the edge of the 21st century, she listened carefully to the horse's song until she had memorized it and harmonized. She wanted to ask many questions about the new song when she visited the horses next. Finally, the horses stopped screaming their song, and Big Mom listened to the silence that followed. The horses' silence lasted for minutes, maybe centuries, and made her curious. She understood that silence created its own music, but never knew that horses to remain that quiet. After a while, she stood and started to walk down the mountain to the clearing where the horses gathered. Of course, she wanted to ask about the silence that followed their new song. They all held their breath as they drove over the reservation border. Nothing happened. No locks clicked shut behind them. No voices spoke, although the winds moved through the pine trees. It was dark. There were shadows. Those shadows took shape, became horses running alongside the van. Chess, Checkers, and Thomas all looked at each other with fear and wonder. A shadow horse was running so close to the van that Chess could have reached out and touched it. Then she rolled down her window and reached out to touch that shadow, that horse. It was hot and wet. Checkers reached out her window and touched a horse of her own. Well, Thomas drove the van, illuminating more shadows galloping down the road in front of them. The horses were following, leading Indians toward the city, while other Indians were traditional dancing in the longhouse after the feast. While drunk Indians stood outside the trading post drinking and laughing, Robert Johnson and the man who was probably Lakota played a duet. Big Mom sat in her rocking chair, measuring time with her back and forth, back and forth, back and forth, there on the Spokane Indian Reservation. She sang a protection song, so none of the Indians, not one, would forget who they are. In a dream, Chess, Checkers, and Thomas sat at the drum with Big Mom during the powwow. All the Spokane Indians crowded around the drum too. They all pounded the drum and sang. Big Mom taught them a new song, the Shadow Horses song, the Slaughtered Horses song, the Screaming Horses song, a song of mourning that would become a song of celebration. We have survived. We have survived. They would sing and sing until Big Mom pulled out that flute built out of the bones of the most beautiful horse who had ever lived. She played a note, then 2, 3, then 900. One for each of the dead horses. Then she'd keep playing 900, 9,000, 9 million, one note for each of the dead Indians. So, I need one table of brave souls who would be willing to do what I do with students all the time, whether they're adults or even kindergarten kids do this. It's called a Socratic Circle. I put a little provocative question to you, and then you talk about it amongst yourselves. I'll pass a microphone, and the rest of us get to listen. And it's kind of a culmination, and we went through this in a really, from time immemorial, right, to today. Like we were on a jet. So any table willing to take this provocative question? And maybe I should say the question, and the question is, given the competing and powerful and emotional and divergent narratives of history of this place where we are, how then do we, as people in this place, share that history, teach that history to young people? Because it's not really happening a lot today. There's a single master narrative that has been taught. And so given what we've just grappled with, anybody want to take that on? Ken, you're nodding your head. Are you agreeing for your group? Okay, teachers back here? Okay. Okay, Diane volunteered, you guys.
Good. I love teachers.
So in a Socratic seminar, here's how it works, and it's really hard as a teacher, Jim, having been a teacher. You put this question to the students, and if there's an awkward silence, you don't step in as a teacher, and it's really hard not to do, but you let the awkward silence remain. And then often the next thing that's said is very important. So here's a question. Given these competing, powerful narratives, and we know that two people going through a historic moment may experience it very differently based on their gender, their age, their socioeconomics, etc. And so it isn't that one person's experience is right or wrong, it's different, isn't it? Because they're experiencing it in a different way. So what do we do with all of this as people from this place? What should we do?
I'm glad to start. You know, I think I grew up on the Fort Peck Reservation, but, you know, how do you make this history visible? The competing history. So much of our history is visible in our structures. The Mullan Trail, roads, buildings, everything comes from that cultural kind of perspective. So one thing I was thinking when you asked that question, Julie, are things like naming things. Naming is such a powerful tool for understanding who we are and what our place is. So, for example, when we renamed 86 squaw sites in the state, taking 10 years, giving them back their traditional or other names, I think that's important. And in this case, I wonder with even the Mullan Trail, there'd be the possibility in terms of the signage and all to give other perspectives to it, even through the signage and how the Mullan Trail is taught. It's a great opportunity to teach people the varieties of perspectives on that specific space and place and its history. I don't know how it's taught, I don't teach in schools, but it's my thought. Patrice?
Well, I'm a high school librarian, and I love to tell stories, to share stories, and I think storytelling is a beautiful way to gain understanding, to connect with another person's feelings, and I think that's how one way I would like to approach it.
Please, Mike.
My name is Mike Studi. I'm the manager of Milltown State Park, so I'm interested in the Mullan Road in a particular spot, and we're embarking on this effort to interpret this place through time immemorial, and we've started with the overlook that I think a bunch of folks will be going to tomorrow. I'll see you all there, I think. But we worked thus far with the Salish Monterey Cultural Committee on trying to tell the whole story, and it's not always an easy story to tell, and so we're going to be continuing on in this process, and in this one particular place at the confluence of the Clark Fork and the Blackfoot Rivers, and I look forward to it. I'm a little scared in some ways. A lot of it is personal to me as well. My family roots in Montana go back to the 1880s, but they came over on the Northern Pacific, which was, a successor to the Mullan Road and all that came before it. And so, I'm not sure where I'm going with all this right now, but just that it is essential to tell these stories, but how the challenge of doing it, I'm looking forward to working with others on it. So.
I want another question for you, Mike, but I do think the stories are very personal. They're connected to our own family's history and our own involvement as part of that history in all of that we're discussing here. So it is very emotional. I think it's okay to admit that. And in fact, I think it's important the people who are working on interpretation of all of these sites bring their own sense of who they are and the conflicts and all the feelings and everything that goes with that into this discussion. There's no other way to do it. It's not a set of historic facts, and there's just one set of them. It's a whole understanding of who you are in the world and how other people are in the world. And so I appreciate you bringing that out, because I think that's extremely important in working yourself and other people through the process of the stories of these places.
I'm Alice Ridge, and I represent the Yellowstone Trail Association. We are from Wisconsin. We don't have vigilantes in Wisconsin. And unlike our interest in the Yellowstone Trail is 3,600 miles. We have many spots. I've been thinking all afternoon about how we can take this information that we've been given and make use of it, connecting with the Yellowstone Trail. It did run many miles with the Mullan Road here and there. And I'm beginning to think that in light of this presentation, the best thing we can do is to address the fact that the Indians were the first pathfinders, be they the Chippewa in Wisconsin, the Ojibwa in New York, etc. So I think I can use what you have given us, what you others have given us, in giving some background. It isn't just the gravel of the Yellowstone Trail. Thank you.
My only thought is that much of the enlightenment that comes into our societies comes through the experiences and the eyes and the openness of young people. And we have all had different ways of learning than today's young people have. And so our ways of helping them to understand history is going to have to incorporate new technologies and things that will interest them on a small screen or in pop culture, pop media. Young people can carry things forward, and maybe this is one of the things our young people can do.
I think that may be it.
Okay, I guess that's it. Thank you. If you don't want your handouts, leave them on the table. I'll use them again for another activity. I hate to waste paper. I'm always into recycling. Yes?
Hey, Julie, I have a question I'd like to pose to the group and to you. It's not very PC. But I'm reading something that relates to this, and a lot of people here know who Father DeSmet is. And what I'm reading in the book right now is he's conflicted on whether Indians should be sent to reservations or not. He's trying to look at the future, and he's trying to decide if we don't have reservations, are the natives going to be assimilated like most of the countries in the world, or should I side for reservations? And he decides, I'm at the point where he's deciding for reservations.
Or culture can be preserved.
So you must get that question, some of this group must get that question, and I don't know.
Are you saying the reservation's a good idea or bad?
Yeah, I'm saying it's an interesting perspective.
It is, and I think I was just in Astoria, Oregon, and talking with teachers applying Montana's essential understandings to Oregon and reading the history of Oregon, of tribes there, which was very sorrowful to me. To read about the Klamath being terminated, a tribe that was doing very well economically because of timber resources and economic development, who were then terminated, except for one, Edmund Chiloquin, who refused to terminate. And so they had to maintain a small land base, and he refused, and now the Klamath have been reinstated. But some treaties were not ratified by Senate, so tribes negotiated in good faith. That's why in California there are no big reservations. Those tribes negotiated treaties, the Senate didn't ratify them, and so you have these small missions or rancherias, you know, and that's a very sinful part of U.S. history, to negotiate in good faith and then have the Senate not ratify that treaty, and tribes not knowing that. So if you look at Oregon and what happened there, and what happens when people who have whose spirituality is very land-based, you know, and who have really an intimate relationship with place that's both spiritual, emotional, physical, and intellectual, and to be removed from that, I think was devastating, you know, not just economically, but I think in all of those other ways, to be removed from places that were like churches, you know, it would be like taking churches away and things like that. So I think reservations, you know, while Indians lost a lot of land, I'm very thankful for the land base that we were able to reserve, even though it was a small portion. You know, the Hellgate Treaty only recognized 12 million acres, but they were negotiating with us with where we were at that time. You know, we had to move on the other side of the divide, because before the settlers were other dispossessed Indians. So Pend Oreille had permanent camps on the Sun River. You know, we lived on the other side of the mountains. We were buffalo people. And so the buffalo country was our country. You know, Crow came later. All the tribes in Montana were not always here. You know, you had this huge dispossession of tribes. Where were the Crow Creek Dakota? They were in Minnesota. Now they're in South Dakota. You know, the hanging of those men in Minnesota when they were their lands were being reduced. So while reservations were sorrowful in loss, having a land base is so important to tribes. Having a land base is so incredibly important. For us, we have this unique privilege for Salish and Pend Oreille people to live in a portion of the homeland where we always lived. For a lot of tribes, they had to make a new home. And so that is a very unique privilege, and that I appreciate. You know, when I was driving up from the Bitterroot and I stopped at the medicine tree, it's an emotional thing for me, because it's standing there and realizing that I'm making my prayers like all my ancestors and relatives have always done. So I count it a privilege to still have a connection to these places, and to still be able to go there and to love and live, you know, where I can go to the Flathead River or up in the Jocko. I mean, a lot of tribes do not have that. They're in a newer place, even though they've attached very fiercely to the place where they are. So were reservations bad? There was a lot of loss, but for those tribes who were able to maintain some land base, you know, what a blessing. Yes?
Those who are not a resident of the immediate area may not know that some years ago, the last grade school built in Missoula is called what? Jean Charlo. And those kids, as they come in grade K, are probably told by the principal why that school has that name instead of Scott Sproul School.
I think we better cut it off. I hate to, because I think she's given us an interesting perspective that we aren't used to getting.
Thank you, Bill. Thank you, Kim.